Well, hello everyone again, and welcome to Christian Biblical Church of God's Sabbath morning here in the Eastern time zone online fellowship meeting. We call it GoToMeeting 2. And again, we're scattered all across the face of the earth, everywhere you can think of. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, EU, South Africa, Latin America, and so on. We're able to through the wonder of the technology that we have today, connect with everyone and as a family, and enjoy the opportunity to hear one of God's ministers speaking on the truth, and enjoy the fellowship that comes after that. So today we're going to hear from one of our elder in Australia, and he's going to be giving us a subject. It's a secret. It's a mystery. I don't know what it is. So we're going to let him give us the title. And so today, I want to present to you Roy Assanti.
Thank you, Steve. And the title is Getting a Right Perspective. Getting the perspective of our calling correct, right, balanced. And it's quite a serious message tonight, or in the morning, wherever you are. And you know, it's helpful to stand back sometimes and look at life and look at our calling, and just get a right perspective. What I'm talking about, yesterday, for example, I spent some time with one of our brethren in hospital, and she's actually waiting to die. She's in her 80s. I know that God could heal her, but this is the situation that June Lambert is in. June has lost motor functions of her body. She can barely look at you. She might squeeze your finger with a yes or no. She is losing the ability to move her hand to point to a yes and a no on the chart that she has. There's a big yes and a big no. And they're basically answering questions. It's a slow deterioration. She is a prisoner in her body. And yesterday I did pray over her, spent most of the day with her, or traveling to her. And it sort of brought to knowledge, or to an awareness, the importance of a two-way communication, because it could go one way from us, but it's very, very difficult to get a response coming back. And you know, that reminded me also of prayer. It's very important to be able to seek God's guidance and seek his direction and get an answer, get some kind of feedback. It was a little bit frustrating. And, you know, there are also other trials that I come across with, you know, spouses not in the church. We talked about that earlier today, or in the previous meeting. And there are trials of those whose partners in life have not believed, or they believed. And you know, I look at faces that are white-haired and worn, and you can see the trials that they're going through. And so it's very important to understand that, you know, and to get things in perspective. It's not isolated. Difficulties, problems, and hassles that we are given, they're not isolated. There's a reason for it. There are some that go through difficulties through life continually and have to deal with it. Why? I mean, why? The question is, why do God's people have to face these headwinds, these difficulties, these trials? And if we look at Isaiah, we'll just go to a few scriptures. Isaiah 30 and verse 9. You know, we are called from a specific mindset that we have. This is the natural mindset that we all naturally have and are given, that we need to work from. And there's a reason why we have to go through hardships, suffering, and difficulties. Isaiah 30, verse 9, says that this is a rebellious people, lying children. They are children who will not hear the law of the Lord. And what is the natural inclination of such a mindset? And a mindset that everyone comes from, of the flesh. The mindset is this: who say to the seers, see not, and to the prophets, do not prophesy right things to us, but speak to us smooth things, things that are easy, simple. And if we also look on the same subject at Luke 14 and verse 15. Then one of those, situation here with Christ, then one of those who sat at the table with him, after hearing these things, said to him, behold, blessed is the one who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. But he said to him, a certain man gave a great supper and invited many. Now this is the natural mindset from which we come. We are of this world. We are of the flesh. Verse 17, and he said to his servants, and he sent his servants at supper time to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But everyone with one consent began to excuse himself. The first said to him, I have bought a field. We all have these, initially had these excuses because we live in this world and we are tied to this world, to the things of this world. I have bought a field and I need to go out and see it. I beg you, have me excused. And in a sense, that was my personal position after leaving a business. I mean, I could have gone out into business and kept on going, but no, there was something different. However, continuing, this is what we are part of. Verse 19, and another said, I have bought 5 pairs of oxen, and I'm going to try them out. I beg you, have me excused. We make choices. There are choices before us, and these are the natural choices that we are faced with. Verse 20, and another said, I've married a wife. Because of this, I'm unable to come. So all these situations and circumstances take us away, marriage feast, from a calling that God gives us. And if we look at Romans 8 and verse 7, it says, because this is the reason. God is spirit. He's on a different level. And our minds are not naturally geared to think, to walk, to act the same way that God does. It says, because, we'll go to verse 6, for to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace, God's way. Because the carnal mind, the normal, natural mind that we all have, that we have to come from, is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God. And furthermore, it says, neither can it be. So I know that we begin with something pretty basic, but in life, we're given difficulties, problems, obstacles to overcome, and they drive us away from this particular mindset, from the physical to the spiritual mindedness. and they are very hurtful at times. It hurts to be changed. It hurts to have a different way of thinking because we want to be naturally comfortable where we are. And if we look at Proverbs, I'll just quote Proverbs 20 and verse 30. That also tells us the procedure. Proverbs 20 and verse 30. Proverbs 20 and verse 30, there's a principle there. And that principle is what we experience through life when we have to change, when we have to be changed, when we have to be molded. As God says in many areas, we're like clay and we have to be changed in shape and formed. It's symbolic of the character. And so here the process is described. It says that in Proverbs 20 verse 30, the stripes that wound purge away evil. Yes, strokes cleanse the innermost parts of one's being. And that is the procedure that we go through to be changed from flesh to spirit-mindedness. And so also, if we look at James, James tells us the same thing in James 1. James 1. And if we look at verse 2, James 1 verse 2. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you are beset by various trials. And I think of June as I sat there. I mean, it's not joyful. I received certain text at the moment with one of our brethren that was there, and she was in consternation. She couldn't communicate. The nurses were, well, it's more a skeleton staff, and she's not counting it for joy. It is a tremendous trial, and we go through, each of us goes through, and we know we go through our trials, and we know that it is not pleasant. However, we are told to count it all for joy when we go through various trials. Verse 3, knowing that the testing, that's what it's for. We have to be tested in attitude. The testing of your faith produces endurance. And that's a character trait that we have to have. That's what they're there for. But let endurance have its perfect work so that you may be perfect and complete, not lacking in anything. So also, if we go to verse 12, it says the end result of a trial. It says, blessed is the man or the woman who endures trials, because after he or she has been proved, like the oxen, the guy that had to go out and prove the oxen to see whether they were going to pull evenly. After you have been tested and proved, he shall receive a crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. So they're the reasons why. Now, today or tonight, I'm going to talk about three basic categories of trials. The first one is the sudden, unexpected trial that generally hits the weakness of the flesh. It's suddenly something happens and we don't expect it. And we know what we should do, yet will we do it? And it comes by surprise. And the second one is linked to obedience, doing God's will. You know, sometimes doing what's right, doing God's will seems wrong. It seems wrong to us, but it is right to God. And we need to stick to it. and stick to God's word and remain faithful. And then thirdly, I'm going to go through an overview of lifelong trials, the end result, the recurring trials over a span of time. So firstly, the sudden and unexpected trials. Let's go to 1 Samuel 26. 1 Samuel 26. 1 Samuel 26, and we'll begin in verse 7. Now, the situation is that King David is being hunted down by King Saul. Saul is dead set with the understanding, and he knows that he's going to be replaced, and he will not be replaced as king if he kills David. And again, he's also demon influenced and so on, as we understand the context. And so that's the situation. So this is what happens. Now, he's tested. David is tested. We go to verse 7. So David and Abishai, his commander, came to the people by night, and behold, Saul lay sleeping in the tent, and his spear stuck in the ground at his head. But Abner, his commander, let's see, where was I? But Abner and the people lay all about him. And Abishai, it was obvious, we've got him. The commander looks at David and says, he's done, right? So Abishai said to David, it was so obvious, God has shut up your enemy. This is God's action here into your hand this day. Now, please let me strike him with the spear, even to the earth at once. Now, these guys knew exactly where the organs were. He knew he could get him through whatever it is, the third rib through the heart, and he was done. You're done. And I will not smite him a second time. And David's, okay, so there it is. The situation is, the answer is there. What are you going to do? He's there in your hands. You can kill him. Do you want to kill him? And so that's the point where a decision has to be made. And David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, except the Lord, he knew, he trusted God. He said, God's going to strike him. His time is going to come to die, but I am not going to do this. I'm not going to kill the Lord's anointed. He knew it was the wrong thing to do, even though the power was in his hand to do it. So what has it got to do? It's a principle. What about our work, our job, for example? When we can, if we can fudge things, if we can sort of turn things around a little bit, not so clear, and it's obvious no one's watching, what do you do? I guess, what do you do? The question is, when no one is watching, do you do the right thing? Do you do the thing that God would have us do in right character when nobody's there and you can do what you like? Well, here's a principle. We wrestle against principalities in Ephesians 6:12, spiritual wickedness in high places. If we go to 1 Peter, now this is another force that we are against. 1 Peter, and we go to chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5. And we'll start, let's see, chapter 5. No, we'll go to chapter 5, yes, 8, verse 8. And here's the instruction. Here's another power. And in John 3, we are told that the Spirit is like the wind that blows. Suddenly there's a force that's there and it pushes us one way or the other. I mean, we're talking about God's spirit there, but Satan is also a spirit. The demons, the principalities are also spirits, and they can just appear and be present like the wind. And so if we look at chapter 5 of 1 Peter, and we look at verse 8, be sober, here's the warning, be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, is prowling about as a roaring lion, seeking anyone he may devour, whom resist. Okay, well, in that example, David resisted. Steadfast in faith, knowing that the same afflictions are being suffered amongst your brethren who are in the world. All right, well, that is the situation. And, you know, looking at that, I like to watch these nature films. I don't know how they film these lions, but you can see them. They're watching, looking at herds, just sitting there, observing. And when they see one limping, either young or old, they pick their targets. And so the thing is with us, we need to be vigilant and strong and look at our weak points, because that is where we will be tested. And in Proverbs 6:5, we get the instruction to flee like the gazelle, free yourself, get away from it. And if we look at 2 Samuel, another example, 2 Samuel 11. Second Samuel 11, and we read from verse 1. Now, here's another situation with David. All right, years have passed. He's now in control. He's ruling, and he's in his palace, and he's on the roof. And probably his army and his commanders said, look, we can handle this. They went out to war. You don't have to come. And so he stayed back. And so what happens? What happens when we are converted? We have years of overcoming behind us. We've overcome big trials and difficulties and hardships, and we've been successful, like the example that we just read about David. And then something happens. Do we relax? Do we say, oh, we're okay now? It applies personally. Chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, verse 1. And it came to pass at the turn of the year, at the time kings go forth to war, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the children of Ammon and circled Rabbah, and David remained in Jerusalem for whatever reason. So what happens? No trials, no difficulties. What happens? And it came to pass, verse 2, one evening David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. So he was looking, and I would guess that she was looking back. So when there's peace and there's safety and there's no worries, what happens? The spirit, the adversary, can suddenly come upon us, and we need to know our weaknesses. We need to know our vulnerabilities, because he was not aware, probably, that he had one. And so what happened? And David sent and asked about the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Okay, she's married. What are you doing? And yet he was gripped. He was taken by surprise. And he called for her. And David sent messages to her and took her. And she came to him. She didn't have to come to him. She could have said no. But she said yes to the king. So you see, it's two ways. And he lay with her, and obviously we know the situation. She became pregnant, and that was it. The lion stalks its prey. If we have a weakness, if we let down, and each of us needs to understand our strengths and our weaknesses. Now that was obvious. You and I need to know where we can let down, where we can be attacked. You know, we in a situation like David was. No one was looking. He could do it. And that's what happened. If we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it describes the situation. And we look at verse 12. It says, therefore, let the one, now, this is not talking to a novice. This is talking to someone that's been doing battle and striving continually, and we can fall into this situation. Therefore, let the one who thinks he stands, or she thinks she stands, take heed, lest she fall. So we can't take it for granted. If we look at the context here, that we need to be aware and taken in surprise, like verse, let's go to verse 6. Now these things became examples for us. Why? Why examples for us? Because they can happen, because we can be caught, because we can be snared. Otherwise it wouldn't be there. These things happened as examples for us, that we might not lust after evil things as they lusted. Neither be idolaters, as some of them were. As is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now that couldn't happen to us. Well, David was a man after God's own heart, and it happened to him. Neither should we commit sexual immorality, as some of them committed, and 23,000 were destroyed in one day. Neither should we tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted him and were killed by serpents. Numbers 21:6 records it. And so on. Neither should we complain. I mean, why am I going through this difficulty? Why? This is not fair. This is not right. Well, we need to watch our attitude. So the next point is that trials, okay, another point on this is trials can also be linked to obedience. Now, Abraham, if we look at Hebrews 11 verse 8, Hebrews 11 verse 8, it says that by faith, okay, Abraham, being called of God to go out into the place which he would later receive for an inheritance, obeyed and went. He just went, not knowing where he was going. God said, go, and he went. God tells us to go, and we go. But does that mean it's easy traveling all the way? Let's look at one of the obvious and outstanding trials that Abraham went through in Genesis 22. We look at Genesis 22, and we'll look at it closely. Something pretty obvious. Genesis 22, and we start with verse 1. And it came to pass, okay, he's on his way. We are on our way to God's kingdom. We have been called. We're making tracks. And it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here am I. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, through whom the promises were going to be fulfilled, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell you. Now, I mean, we know that. We've read that how many times? We understand that. But I wonder, are these just words? Can you and I picture having our son or daughter tied up and having a knife to their throat? Perhaps you have a wonderful little grandson, or maybe not so little, or a granddaughter. I mean, I have only young grandchildren, but to think of having a little child, right? I know that he was 13 years old or so, or 15 perhaps, but Isaac. But can you imagine that? Can you imagine having a knife to their throat, and how, you know, what it would take? It's very easy to read this. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. Okay, he split the wood. He did everything he had to do. And verse 4, and there on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, a place not so far off. Okay, so he's had his men stay back and he went up. And then verse 8, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide, because he said, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham still, info, said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering. He knew it. God's not going to allow me to kill my son. But how far did it go? So they both went up together. And okay, so we look at verse 10. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Okay, so arm stretched out, and he actually would have taken the plunge. And the angel of the Lord called out to him from the heavens and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here am I. Now, notice what happens here. And he said, do not lay your hand upon the son, nor do anything, your son, not do anything to him. For now I know. How did God know? Right? Seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Well, verse 13 says that, and Abraham lifted up his eyes. So what would have happened? His eyes were down, his face was down. It could have been that an angelic force would have knocked the knife sideways. He was at the point of no return. Could you imagine that with a son? And, you know, if you only have a daughter, or a daughter alive, or a little grandchild, could you imagine what it would have taken? He was at the point of no return. And God provided the sacrifice. So I guess that Abraham was given this trial, a specifically tailored trial for him, because this is exactly what God the Father had to go through when he allowed his son to be sacrificed, and to be sacrificed for sin the way he was. If we look at, there's Matthew 27:46 and Mark 15:34. They both say the same thing. Let's look at Mark 15 and verse 34. Mark 15 and verse 34. This is the point. And at the 9th hour, when Christ was there, sacrificed, until then he had the power of the Father, the strength, the love, which helped him endure the trial, the difficulty, the pain, the suffering that he was going through. And then suddenly something happened. Verse 34, and at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice through pain, through suffering. And he just cried out and saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so the Father had to turn around and look away. And for that time, Christ symbolized sin, and he became abhorrent to the Father. So I guess with Abraham, because of his position, and as Christ said, I go to prepare a place for you. Now, his position in the kingdom required that he goes through a similar suffering or a simulated suffering that the Father went through. Now, each of us are going to have our own trial, our own difficulty to overcome throughout the course of our calling, so that we can be prepared, so that we can be tested, and so that we can be qualified to inherit the position that is being specifically prepared for you and for me. I would say that was a moment of absolute extreme intensity. Now, the next form of trials are the lifelong tests and trials. Now, we are promised to inherit a kingdom, an inheritance, a position, unending life. Can you imagine that? Unending life, joy continually, accomplishment unending. And the universe is unending. It shows God's handiwork, God's greatness. And so the point is that we are like a chunk of clay. We have faults. We have gaping faults and difficulties. Now, Jacob, the example of Jacob really does fit here, because Jacob also had faults. Jacob was a supplanter. He was a shyster. He was one that takes by the heel. Now, that was his fault. That was his chunk of character that had to be formed. But you and I are also imperfect. We are a chunk of clay, for example. The comparison is that has to be formed and shaped into something of beauty, of character. And as the Apostle Paul said, that he waited for the time when Christ would be formed in you, in those that he was pastoring. And indeed, it applies to you and to me today. And we have to overcome, we have to be changed on this journey. In Revelation 3, verse 21, you could note that down, we have to conquer. It says, he who conquers, we have to conquer. We have to preside over a change in us and direct it willfully. He who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne. Now, in brief, we'll just go through some of the highlights of Jacob's story. And, you know, this is the way he was. Let's go to Genesis 25. Genesis 25. And we'll start in verse 22. Genesis 25, 22. And this is the beginning. From pre-birth, God forms us in the womb, and our character, our potential is there from the womb. Verse 22, and the sons struggled together within her. And she said, the mother, if it is well, why am I this way? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, okay, it was told, it was revealed at the start. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 kinds of people shall be separated from you, from your belly. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the older shall serve the younger. Okay, that was the promise. Now, we're going to go forward to, let me see, Genesis 27, verse 33. Let's see if I got that right. No, it's Genesis 27, verse 33. That's correct. Now, what happened was that well, I'll just read 27:33. Then Isaac trembled greatly, and he said, who then was... Okay, so what had happened was that it was between mother and son, and Jacob went and pretended to be his brother, and he cheated his father. And so what happened was he trembled greatly, and there was a bitter cry. Then Isaac trembled greatly and said, who then was the one who has hunted deer and brought it to me? And I have eaten it all before you came. Okay, so this is when Esau went up to his father and said, okay, bless me, here it is. And the end result was that you shall see me, okay, verse 34. And when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with a great and exceedingly bitter cry and said to his father, bless me, even me also, O my father. And he said, your brother came with deceit, and he's taken away your blessing. Well, he had the blessing anyway, but he resorted to trickery, to being a shyster, to one who takes by the heel. That was his character. And Esau said, is he not rightly called Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, he's taken away my blessing. And he said, have you not reserved one blessing for me? And Isaac answered and said to Esau, behold, I've made him your lord, and all his brethren I've given him for servants. And with grain and wine I've sustained him. And what shall I do for you now, my son? It brings to mind that there's a time that there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth when we understand that Esau had sold his birthright for a bowl of soup, not a man of character. So the bottom line here is that this deception, and I'm just being brief here, this deception came back on the head of Jacob. And Jacob, with all his faults, with all the difficulties of character that he had, basically shows the journey that we also have to make through our difficulties, with our faults, and to have to overcome. So the trickery came back to him. And if we look at Genesis 29, and verse 13. Okay, so what happened was that Jacob had to leave. He had to go because his brother then was planning to kill him. And so his mother sent him, and the father also, by trickery again, sent him to the mother's brother, Laban, okay, the uncle. And he was, just as it comes to be, a greater shyster and tricker than Jacob himself. Verse 13, and it came to pass when Laban heard the news of Jacob's sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And Jacob told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, surely you are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and stayed with him a month. Now, he was probably so glad to be safe and away from his brother, and naturally he was a productive worker, and Laban saw this. And so this is what happened. Verse 15, and Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, should you then serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall be your wages? And so, okay, Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the younger was Rachel. Verse 17, and Leah had lovely soft eyes, but Rachel, had lovely soft eyes, but Rachel was beautiful and well favored. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve you 7 years, 7 years, 7 years for Rachel, the younger daughter. And what did Laban say? He said, it's better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me. Okay, so he served him for 7 years, right? And for Rachel, and they seemed to him only a few days for the love he had for her. Okay, so then the time came, and Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, so that I may go into her. Pretty direct. Well, he wanted to marry her. Okay, so then Laban gathered together all the men of the place. Okay, so when the time came to give him his wife, we know what happened. Verse 24 and verse 23. And it came to pass in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Okay, so the marriage was consummated and he got the wrong one. Now, in the morning, what happened? Time come to pass, verse 25, in the morning, that behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you tricked me? He was not too happy. Do you think that the thought may have come to mind about what he did to his brother? He tricked his brother, and it was all really unnecessary because God had said that the younger, right, the older would serve the younger anyway. Okay, so we know the story. It all went on, and he ended up marrying and working another 7 years, and then through the various children, there was trouble in the family and difficulties and hardships and problems, and the wife that he loved couldn't bear children. That all happened, and so there were many other curveballs served to Jacob by Laban. The flocks, he served him for the flocks, and Laban tricked him. And then finally, when he got away, he was after his idols. That was a great excuse to go back and hunt him down. But again, God appeared to him. And so he got mad after Laban chased him down. And then there came another twist in Genesis 31. Genesis 31, verse 30. It says, and now you have gone because you longed after your father's house. So he says, why have you stolen my gods? Right? So, okay. What happened then was that with his own mouth, he pronounced a curse on the wife that he loved, the one that he wanted, that gave him joy. In verse 30 we read, verse 30, let's see there. Genesis 31, verse 36. Verse 36. And Jacob, okay, Jacob was angry and rebuked Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin that you have so hotly pursued me? For you have searched all my stuff, and you have found of all your household stuff. Set it here before my brethren and your brethren, that they may judge before us. So let's see. I had here where yes, verse 32. Sorry, verse 32. Okay, so in his anger, and he knew that God had revealed to him not to touch Jacob at all, to be careful. Okay, so now he got bold. And in verse 32, he says, with whomsoever you find your gods, let him not live. In the presence of our brethren, point out what I have that is what I have that is yours, and take it for yourself. For Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. And so this led to the premature death, because he put that curse out on Rachel. Another surprise, another pain, another difficulty in the course of his life. And then if we look at, let's see, this is the gripe that Jacob had. He looked back at his history. If we look at Genesis 31, verse 6, verse 36, and Jacob was angry and rebuked Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin that you have so hotly pursued after me? For you've searched all my stuff. And what have you found of all your household stuff? Set it here before my brethren and your brethren, that they may judge between us both. I was with you these 20 years. Now, this is what happened to him. I was with you these 20 years. Your ewes and your she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of your flock I have not eaten. That which was torn by the wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. You required it at my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. I was there in the day, and the heat consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. And I have been 20 years in your house, and I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 for your flocks, and you've changed my wages 10 times. Okay, so that's his frustration. That's his suffering. But if we look at it and we look at the course of our lives, we can look back at the trials and the difficulties and the hardships that we have gone through. And they are demonstrated also by the life of Jacob. Now, at the end, though, he did get through it. He overcame. In chapter 32 and verse 24. And Jacob was left alone. Okay. He was left alone. This is one of these alone moments again. And a man wrestled there with him until the breaking of day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh became out of joint. And he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. Now, he wrestled with him through the night. The tenacity, the desire for vindication. And Jacob said, I will not let you go, except you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And verse 28, he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Okay, so he won. He won out. And the life of Jacob shows trial, frustration, difficulty. He sees himself in the mirror, and what he dished out, he got. And I wonder if we really look at our lives, do we see ourselves? Do we see trials recurring again and again? Are we able to examine ourselves and say, hey, what's going on? Because we need to examine and to change. And finally, his actual name was changed to one who overcomes. And so it didn't finish there, because after that, Esau still came after him with 400 men. And again, in Genesis 37, 31 to 35, there was a deception over the son who he loved, Joseph. He thought Joseph was dead, and he cried. He mourned his son, only after to rejoice to see him again. But the bottom line is that he said his years were few and they were vain. They were painful, because he went through these difficulties and these trials. Now, I could finish this off with Matthew 24, verse 13, or Mark 13, 13, where it says that he who endures to the end of the trials, the difficulties, shall be saved. But what I want to do is conclude rather with another scripture in Matthew 7 and verse 24. And this scripture we normally look at and we emphasize that we need to be built on a rock, on a, as it says, Petra, a giant outcrop of rock, so we could be solid. However, here, my emphasis is that we will need to go through testings and trial and difficulties, and that is portrayed by another symbol here. Matthew 7 and verse 24. Getting a right and practical perspective, it's about the storms, it's about the winds, the floods that beat against our lives, that change us, that move us, that we need to remain as anchored and strong. And if we go through it, verse 24, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and practices them, I will compare him to a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rain came down, like we have had adverse weather. The rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew, but it did not fall, for it was founded upon a rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not practice them shall be compared to the foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And the rain came down, the trials will come, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So what will happen in your life? What will happen in my life? The winds are going to come. The difficulties, the hardships we will have to face. So in conclusion, we need to be wary that we need to remain anchored and steadfast right to the end, regardless of the troubles, the trials, the testing, the difficulties that we will face. And it is also good to look at the example of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, who endured to the end.